The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, because they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, because they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A gospel inspired by God. In November of 1972, after spending 8 years in the seminary, I was assigned to go to Kenya, to work in Kenya, East Africa, to a diocese of Nakuru. And the first mission I was appointed to was a place called Njoro. And my task there was to try to learn the ropes from an older missionary and also to learn Swahili. So I was learning Swahili. And then in the middle of 1973, I actually went to Tanzania, which is the home of real good Swahili. It's where real Swahili is spoken. It's like if you want to learn real English, you have to go to Cork. So I went to Tanzania for 3 months in the middle of 1973 to the real Swahili. And I came back in September 1973, and I was reassigned to a new mission, a place called Kipchimchim. And I was made headmaster of Kipchimchim Harambee Secondary School. That sounds like a very prestigious title. It's not. A Harambee school in Kenya is a school that's been literally built by the parents and financed by the parents. There's no government involvement whatsoever. And the kids pay school fees, out of which the teachers' salaries come, and the books are bought and uniforms are bought. And so I had the job of being the headmaster of this outfit for a few years. And I taught math, and I taught physics, and I taught religious education. So at one stage, we were talking about the Bible and biblical translations. So I decided to do a little test with the guys. Now, the vast bulk of the kids in this school were Kipsigis. It's a Kalenjin tribe. But there were a scattering of Kikuyu kids there as well. And Kikuyu is a totally different language from Kipsigis. Kikuyu comes from the Bantu group of languages, as does Swahili, whereas Kipsigis comes from the Nilotic languages. So they're very, very, very different language groups. So for the fun of one day, we're talking about the Bible and biblical translations. So I go up onto the board, and on the left-hand side of the board, I write down a passage in English. And then take one of the Kikuyu kids, and I say, I want you to translate that passage into Kikuyu. So the kid is working very furiously, and he gives me this document with the Kikuyu version of what I'd written on the board in English. And then I take 3 more kids out of the classroom, another Kikuyu and 2 Kipsigis kids. And I give the Kikuyu translation to the Kikuyu kid, and I say, I want you to translate that into Swahili for me. So he sits down outside, and he starts translating the Kikuyu version of the English into Swahili. And he finishes the task. And I take the Swahili version from him, and I give it to one of the Kipsigis kids, and I say, I want you to translate this Swahili version into Kipsigis. So the kid sits down, and he's translating the Swahili version into Kipsigis, and he gives it to me, and I take it from him, and I give it to the other Kipsigis kid, and I say, I want you to translate this Kipsigis version back into English. And this kid translates the Kipsigis version back into English. And I take the English version, go back into the classroom, and I write it side by side with the original English. And they were unrecognizable. You would not believe it was the same text whatsoever. I was trying to illustrate the difficulties of translating, from one language to another. And that's where I want to go today. I want to make just 3 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about biblical problems. And then I'm going to talk about the 4 canonical Gospels. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about unpacking the message. How do we go about unpacking the message? So first, biblical problems. So the difficulty, obviously, is that many of the events described in the Bible, there were no witnesses to. Who was present at creation when God was making the sun and the stars and the moons and whatever? So whose word do we have from it? So how do we know that stuff? And typically we claim that, God revealed this to the people who wrote the Bible. So God is dictating, here's what I did on the first day, and here's what I did on the second day. Or is it possible that people, once we developed the ability to reason, and we had language skills, which happened just about 50,000 years ago with the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens evolved 200,000 years ago and could think, but could not think about thinking, because only language allows us to manipulate symbols inside in our own crania and then create language. And so until 50,000 years ago, we had no symbols to manipulate our ideas. But once we had these ideas, we began to look around us and try to make sense of the world in which we found ourselves. So it is much more likely, rather than that God dictated, here's what I did in the first day, the second and the third day, that people looked around and started making inferences and trying to make sense of their experience that they had. And in the time, they weren't writing theological treatises, and they weren't writing scientific journals. They were writing in story form. They tried to capture in story what their belief system was about how this system came into being. So that's the first problem with any kind of understanding of Bible, that you're dealing with stuff for which there were no witnesses. Can we get the door back there, Mark, for me? Mark, can you just close out the door there? Yeah, great. Thank you. Brilliant. So that's part of the problem, that a lot of the events in the Bible have no witnesses. So we have to believe either God revealed it or people just inferred it through intelligence. Then there's a whole bunch where allegedly there were witnesses. The events around, for instance, Abraham or Moses. And so how do we know that these are true? Because the truth, there was no language, written Hebrew language at the time of Abraham. The only written language at that stage would have been hieroglyphics in Egypt or cuneiform among the Sumerians. And so, were we writing hieroglyphics? Was the Bible originally written in hieroglyphics or cuneiform? And of course it wasn't. In fact, those were very, very difficult kinds of languages. You had literally thousands of symbols to try to represent the ideas that you had in your mind. The Phoenicians came along about the year 950 BC, and they were the first ones to invent an alphabet, and they totally simplified written language. So for the first time ever, they could reduce all sounds down to 22 phonemes. A phoneme is a short burst of sound. So if you take even a syllable, sometimes a syllable is composed of 2 or 3 phonemes. So a phoneme is the shortest little burst of language, a verbal language. So if you even take the syllable I went home, I actually has 2 phonemes. It is ai. So 2 short sounds together give you the sound I. And so the Phoenicians created a system where, with just 22 phonemes, they could represent in written form anything they could think or anything they could see. It was an extraordinary breakthrough. That happened about 950 BC. Very, very quickly, the Greeks borrowed that alphabet from them, and the Romans borrowed that alphabet from them, and the Hebrews borrowed that alphabet from them. But before that, so before 1000 BC, there was no way of writing stuff down unless you resorted to cuneiform or hieroglyphics. So if Abraham flourished in 1850 BC, who recorded what Abraham's adventures were? Or even Moses. Moses flourished about 1250 BC, and he wrote down allegedly the commandments of God. What language was he using to write down the commandments? Was it cuneiform or hieroglyphics? Because at that stage, Hebrew did not have an orthography. So these are the difficulties you get to. Because so for a long, long period of time, whatever explanations they came up with had to be held in oral form. And so the oral tradition is handed down from generation to generation. Now, for us to look back 4,000 years, or even 2,000 years to the time of Jesus, it is very difficult for us to try to put on the same mindset, that the people of the time would have understood these teachings. So when you're dealing with a totally different culture, how do you encapsulate ideas in such a way that they're understood to people 2,000 years into the future? So that's another difficulty we experience. How do you put on that mindset of people who lived 3,000 or 4,000 years ago as you try to make sense of the Bible? And then, of course, you've got the whole business of trying to translate these. So, for instance, in Hebrew, there are no vowel signs in Hebrew. Hebrew only writes its consonants. And that was true at the beginning. When they created their alphabet, it consists of consonants. Now, in the 12th century, they started creating vowel signs. They would put strokes under the consonant or dots under it. But they abandoned that when they revived Hebrew in modern times. And modern Hebrew, if you take a Hebrew newspaper, there are no vowel signs in it. So you have to kind of infer what the vowels are that connect up the consonants in a particular word. Now you take something then written in a language which has no vowel signs, and you take it into a totally different culture, and you try to represent it, for instance, translate it into a language which is a tonal, in which the pitch of the word changes the meaning completely. And Kipsigis, for instance, is semitonal. there are some words in Kipsigis, and depending on the tune of the word, it's going to mean something completely different. For instance, in Kipsigis, the word kiplekweet, depending on where you put the emphasis on the tune, can mean either a rabbit or a fetus, depending on where the tune, you're going up, down, or down, up in it. So it's a semitonal language. So how do you translate ideas from a culture which is 2,000 or 4,000 years old in a language that didn't have vowel signs and now translate it into a language which is tonal or semitonal? It leads to lots of issues. And I've shared this example with you before. So when the Kipsigis were exposed to Christianity, which maybe the 1900s just, and the first attempts were made to translate the Bible into Kipsigis, you had big issues. The Kipsigis were nomadic pastoralists. They had no agricultural background whatsoever. So you take some of the parables of Jesus, agricultural parables, and they're meaningless to these people. They have no idea what you're talking about. Now, even modern urbanized people find it difficult sometimes to understand some of the parables of Jesus that have agricultural kinds of references. So the parable, for instance, that talks about the wheat and the cockle. Jesus tells a story about a farmer going out and setting wheat in his field. And when he was asleep, an enemy came and sowed cockle among the wheat. And then after a few weeks, his workers realized that there's weeds there and they want to pluck them up. And they said to the farmer, do you want us to pluck out the weeds? And the farmer says, no, you'll disturb the wheat if you do that. Wait until harvest time, and then when we harvest them, we'll separate them and we'll burn the weeds and we'll eat the wheat. Now, for most of us in a modern situation, we miss the whole point of that. But to an agricultural people, the interest in this parable is that wheat and cockle are two plants that look identical until they're about 6 or 7 or 8 weeks old. They're identical. And so the guy who said this, he knew they would look alike. Now, it's difficult for us to appreciate that. Imagine you're a nomadic pastoralist who's never seen wheat. They literally had never seen, there was no word for wheat in the Kipsigis language. And so you have to invent a word for wheat, and you have to invent a word for cockle. And so the word that was invented for wheat was just the plural of the word for food. The word, in Kipsigis, the word food is bai, spelled B-A-I in English orthography. And so they created the plural of that as bainik. And now bainik stands for wheat. And now you're going to beat the guy over the head with the meaning of the parable by kind of explaining the joke before you tell the punchline. And so you have to make up a word for cockle, and the word they made up was chemul bainik, which literally means that which imitates wheat. That's the name of cockle in Kipsigis. So you're literally beating the guys over the head with the meaning of it. It's like you're telling them the joke, explaining the joke before you even deliver the punchline. These are part of the difficulties when you start translating from one language to the other. So when we approach the Bible, we have to be really careful. How do you try to put on the mindset of people 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years ago? How do you try to familiarize yourself with the culture and the understanding of their times in order to try to get a hit on what the original message was saying? So I'll treat that in my third point this morning. So in the light of that then, I just want to have a quick look then at the 4 synoptic gospels and as they wrestle with these kinds of issues. Now, if you've ever attempted to write a book, the first thing you have to sit down and figure out is, what's the message I'm trying to convey here? What's my overall thrust? What am I trying to do with this book here? That's the first thing you have to figure out. And the second thing you have to figure out is, and what audience am I pitching it toward? Is this like a scholarly article that's delivered to theologians? Is it a scientific treatise that's delivered to physicists? Is this a story for children? Is this kind of a teaching for the people in the inn who understand the kind of secret symbolism of it? Then am I going to do it in a fictional form, or am I going to do it in some kind of a factual form? And how do I organize my material so that as I present it, it flows logically and it makes sense to the audience? It's a whole bunch of stuff you have to figure out if you attempt to write a book or send out your message. So that's precisely the issue that the 4 synoptics have. So who's their audience? What's their agenda? What are they intending to put across? What form will it take? How will they organize their material? And they all go about it very differently because they're writing for different audiences. So if I were to take them briefly in a chronological fashion, in spite of the fact that we learned as kids the 4 Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they come in a different sequence. Mark's is the first Gospel written. Mark first, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. So Mark is written about 70 AD, Matthew about 80 AD, Luke about 90 AD, and John about 100 AD, roughly speaking. So you take the very first one then, which is Mark's Gospel. And Mark is writing for a Gentile audience. And Mark was not a personal disciple of Jesus. He didn't know Jesus. But he's a very good storyteller. And he goes from one story to the other, and he leaves you almost breathless in the way he takes one story after the other, rushing through it. It's the first of the Gospels, and it's the shortest. There's only 16 chapters in Mark's Gospel. But he really moves through really, really quickly. And he gets right into it with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan. There's no account of the childhood of Jesus whatsoever in Mark's Gospel. And the strange thing is, there are no resurrection appearances of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel ends very, very suddenly. After the death of Jesus, he's been buried, and the women go to the tomb on a Sunday morning, and the tomb is empty, and they're absolutely scared, and they run home, and they say nothing to anybody. There are no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. And to make matters worse, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus only says one thing on the cross, one dying word, and it's almost like an act of despair. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you abandoned me? That's the last thing that Jesus says according to Mark's Gospel. So you get the idea that this man died in despair, and there's no post-resurrection appearance. There's an empty tomb, but there are no resurrection appearances. Now, to rectify that, later versions of Mark's Gospel plagiarized John's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, and they took resurrection stories from Luke and from John, and they tacked them on to the end of Mark's Gospel. So there are 3 different endings to Mark's Gospel, depending on which manuscript you're working from. The oldest one has no resurrection appearances, and then there's one called the freer version, because it's in a library called the Freer Library, and then there's the longer ending. And the longer ending is they literally just borrowed stories. The story of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, they borrowed that from Luke. The story of Jesus meeting Mary of Magdala outside the tomb, they borrowed that from John, and they tack it on to the end of Mark's Gospel. So that's Mark's agenda, and that's Mark's audience. And what he's trying to show is Jesus was a very, very human Messiah. That's his intent, and that's the way he organizes his material. Matthew comes 10 years after Mark, and Matthew has a very, very different agenda. Matthew is intent on showing that Jesus is the new Moses. And so he will look at the life of Moses, and he will try to replicate in Jesus' life the same kinds of events. So in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus has to be down in Egypt, just like Moses was, and has to be threatened by the king of the time who's trying to kill him. So just like the Pharaoh was trying to kill all the Hebrew children, Herod is trying to kill Jesus. And Jesus has to escape down to Egypt. So he has to be placed in Egypt so that he can come out of Egypt into the promised land. Because Jesus is going to lead the people into the promised land, just like Moses intended of leading people into the promised land. So he has to get them down into Egypt in order for that to happen. And then he organizes his gospel into 5 great narratives to represent the 5 books allegedly written by Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're called the Pentateuch in Greek, the 5 books, and allegedly they were written by Moses. Now, we know they weren't, in fact, but the thinking of the time was Moses had written these books. So now Matthew is going to organize his material into 5 great sections, and each section will start off with a bunch of stories and then lead to a teaching of Jesus, and that's how we'll set it up. And this Jesus of Matthew, he will be in the desert for 40 days to represent Moses wandering on the desert for 40 years. He'll bring a new covenant, just like Moses brought the first covenant. Jesus will bring the second covenant. He'll bring them a different kind of promised land, not just a physical territory, but the kingdom of heaven. And he'll feed the crowd in the desert. Like Moses fed them with manna, he's going to feed them with the bread of life, his own body and his own blood. So again and again and again, you see that in Matthew's Gospel, he's trying to make Jesus the new Moses. That's his idea. And he's probably writing in Antioch of Syria. That's where the Gospel has been written, about the year 80 AD. And he's writing primarily for Jewish Christians to impress upon them that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus indeed is the Messiah long awaited by Israel. So that's Matthew's focus and his shtick, and that's how he organizes his material. Luke comes about 10 years after Matthew. And Luke is the only writer in Scripture who's not Jewish. So if you take all the books of the Scriptures, in the Catholic version there are 73 books, in the Protestant version there are 66. But of all of these, it's the only book written by a non-Jew, is Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. And again, it's probably written in Antioch in Syria, and Luke very possibly was a physician. But Luke has a very, very different agenda to Matthew's agenda. Luke is writing for Gentile Christians. And in particular, he actually writes 2 books, 2 parts of one book. The first one is called the Gospel of Jesus, according to Luke, and the second one is called the Acts of the Apostles. So one is the record of Jesus' life, and the other is the record of the life of the Jesus movement after Jesus had died. So that's why he organizes his material. And he's pitching it to the same person. He says this person to whom he pitches it and whom he addresses in both the first volume and the second volume is called Theophilus. Now, Theophilus in Greek literally means God lover. So either Luke is saying anybody who loves God may be interested in this story I have to tell, or else Theophilus was actually a Roman governor, because the language of the literati, even in the Roman Empire, was Greek. Latin was just spoken by the plebs, but the language of literature and of business and of government was still Greek in the Roman Empire. So Theophilus would have been possibly a Roman governor. And Luke he's trying to impress two things on Theophilus. Firstly, that Christianity is not a threat to Rome. At this stage, Christianity is being persecuted. We're now talking about 90 AD, and persecution has begun against the Christian community. And Luke is trying to desperately impress upon this person, Christianity is not a threat to Rome. And secondly, Christianity is not a superstition. Now, superstition is a technical term in the scriptures. We think superstition is about not walking under a ladder, or if you break a glass, throw a pinch of salt over your shoulder. The original meaning of superstition was this. A superstition was a system in which people refused to pay obedience to the local divinities. So when the Romans moved into any place, they were very, very careful to honor all of the local divinities. They believed in regional divinities. It wasn't like that there was one god or that there were Roman gods. There were particular gods who had responsibility for Italy or Rome. And when you moved into a different area, there were different gods responsible for those areas, and you had to make sure you pacified those gods by honoring them in the appropriate fashion. So every place the Romans went and occupied, they honored the local gods, and they insisted that the local people continue to worship their local gods so as not to stir up any kind of divine animosity. And so in order to do this, it had to be an ancient tradition. The Romans believed that unless it was antediluvian, that this particular religion had been founded before the flood, and it was given in a divine oracle, and that the originator had to be a miracle worker and had to bestow eternal life on the devotees. They were the four marks of a real religion as far as Rome was concerned. It had to be antediluvian, had to be founded in a divine oracle, he had to be a miracle worker, and he had to be able to confer eternal life on the adherents. And so any system that broke any of these rules was regarded as superstition. Now, at the time of that Luke is writing, because the Christians had been kicked out of the synagogues by normative Judaism, the Romans now regarded the Christians as a superstition. They were failing to honor the local gods of Judaism, and that was going to create big problems for the Roman governors there. So they persecuted Christians as a superstition. So Luke is trying to impress again upon this Theophilus character, this governor. We are not a superstition. This is an ancient system. This Jesus character is the fulfillment of this old system. But much more importantly for Luke, Jesus is not just a Jewish Messiah come to save Israel. It's interesting when you get to the genealogies, both Matthew and Luke have genealogies of Jesus, but they're very different genealogies, very different. Matthew begins his genealogy of Jesus with Abraham, 1850 BC. And he says there are 14 generations from Abraham to David. Abram flourished about 1850 BC. David flourished about 1000 BC. 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile. The Jews went into exile in the year 589 BC, 14 generations more. And then 14 generations from the Babylonian exile to the birth of Jesus, around 6 BC. So Matthew organizes it into three groups of 14, so 42 generations, but it began only with Abraham. When Luke talks about the genealogy of Jesus, he goes in the reverse order. He starts with Jesus and he works his way back. But he doesn't end with Abraham. He ends with Adam and then God. He says, Jesus was the son of X, who was the son of Y, who was the son of Z, who was the son of Adam, who was the son of God. And so why is Luke doing this? Because Luke is trying to show that Jesus is not just a child of Abraham. He's not just, a Semite, preaching salvation to the Semites. He's a global figure. He goes right back to Adam, who goes right back to God. So he's impressing upon him that this is really the mission of Jesus, that Jesus is a kind of a global figure. So he's got a very, very different agenda from Matthew. Now, both Matthew and Luke borrow very, very heavily from Mark. They plagiarize Mark. which is a strong indication that Mark obviously was written before either Matthew or Luke, because there are whole chunks written in Greek, which is just like cut and paste. You take it out of Mark's account and you paste it into Luke, or you paste it into Matthew's account. And then there's a whole bunch of other material in which verbatim accounts from Luke and Matthew, but they're not coming from Mark. And so the great German scholars of the 1800s presumed there was another source that they called Q for Quelle, meaning source, that there was another source that both Matthew and Luke borrowed from and copied and plagiarized and pasted into their own writings, but didn't come from Mark. And then, of course, there was stuff that Matthew himself found, and there was stuff that Luke himself found. So there were the first three. John's Gospel, then, is very, very different from the first three. So the first three are sometimes called the synoptics. And synoptic in Greek just literally one eye. That is like just one perspective. That these three, although they have different agendas, are basically looking at the same kind of material in the same kind of fashion. John is very, very different. Totally different kind of gospel. And John's Gospel is probably written in Ephesus around the year 100. Now, it is written for third generation Christians. And so the great likelihood is that John, the beloved disciple, had a disciple himself who became known subsequently as John the Elder. And that John the Elder became the leader of the church in Ephesus after John, the beloved, kind of retired from active ministry. And now John the Elder is dying, and he's passing this information on to a third generation Christian who's actually writing the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John is now written by John the Evangelist, and it's not even written by John the Elder. It's stories that this third generation has heard from the second generation, John the Elder. And it's a very, very different kind of a book. It's a much, much, much more highly developed theology than you find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So obviously, you've had now 70 years of reflection on the Christian mystery that will produce the Gospel of John. So it's a very, very different understanding of gospel. So that, as you work your way through the Gospels, then it's important to kind of bear in mind what the perspectives are, what the agenda is, and what the audience is. In John's Gospel also, there's a lot of animosity against three groups in John's Gospel. There's a lot of animosity against what he calls the Jews, so it looks very, very anti-Semitic, although the way in which John is using the word Jews literally has to do with the religious authorities. It's not talking about the people itself as an ethnic group, but unfortunately that word has come to mean, the Hebrew people. And so it's very anti-Semitic in that sense. It's also very much against, John the Baptist had a movement still very strong at the time Christianity was growing. And there was a lot of controversy between the followers of Jesus and the followers of John the Baptist. And so there's some, polemic in John's Gospel against the followers of John the Baptist. And thirdly, they kind of vilify Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, who spent his time in India and may well have been influenced by, a Hindu teaching, Advaita Vedanta. And so it's a very, very different kind of mystical theology. So John makes, in John's Gospel, Thomas is doubting Thomas. So that's kind of very much the agenda of John's Gospel. That's my second point. So then, in the midst of all that, if we have all these problems understanding the mindset and translating stuff, and each of these gospel writers had different agendas for different audiences, how do we meant to unpack the message? When we hear the gospels being written or the scriptures being written at this stage, being spoken or being read, how do we interact with that kind of material? So the first thing is to look at, the teaching method itself. I'm a big believer that in order to teach something effectively, you have to try to archive the wisdom in story form. The easiest way to communicate a truth is not by some kind of highfalutin scientific theory or philosophical discussion, or a theological treatise. It is by telling stories. And so if you go to any culture and you want to know the wisdom of any culture, go to their stories, their folklore, their mythology. They're the archives of the wisdom of the group. And if you want a very pithy distillation of that wisdom, you go to their proverbs. The proverbs are kind of just one-liners that will kind of encapsulate the entire wisdom of a full story. And I told you this many times before. Between my junior year and senior year in high school in Ireland, I spent the entire summer holidays down in West Cork, a place where Gaelic is still the spoken language, a place called ÓLaoire, collecting proverbs from the elders. And one old man told me at one stage, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. He was absolutely right. When you examine the Proverbs are the distillation of the archived wisdom that you find in the story form. And that's precisely what you find actually happening when we're trying to unpack the meaning of the scriptures. The first thing is to go to the stories and then to go to the Proverbs. So where do you find the stories? The stories are the Genesis stories, the creation stories. They're the parables of Jesus. And if you want to get the utter distillation, the proverb form of those, you get it in the Beatitudes. And you find the Beatitudes in two of the books, two of the Gospels. So in some senses, where the parables of Jesus are the archived wisdom of this extraordinary avatar, the Beatitudes are the radical distillation of all that teaching in just 8 little proverbs, 8 little words. Now it's interesting that Luke and Matthew have accounts of the Beatitudes, but in Matthew's version there are 8 of them, and they're all spoken in the third tense. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Luke has only 4. There's only 4 Beatitudes in Luke's Gospel, but he counterbalances them with 4 woes. So he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, but woe to you who are rich. So there's 4 and 4 in Luke's Gospel, and it's spoken in the second person rather than in the third person. So in the middle of all this, how do you then listen to the scriptures, whether you're reading them or you're hearing them being read? How do you try to unpack the message? So I want to finish up by just taking an example of like Eucharist. So for me, Eucharist is like an archetypal story that allows you to interpret, all of the other deeper mysteries of the scriptures. So when I think of Eucharist, I like to differentiate between what I call sign, symbol, and sacrament. A sign is a physical object that stands for another physical object. So a road sign is a piece of metal with paint on it that's pointing to a piece of asphalt a little bit further on in your journey. So it's a physical thing, the road sign itself, a piece of metal and some paint pointing to a piece of tarmac or asphalt. So a sign has both feet and physicality. One physical thing, standing for another physical thing. A symbol is different. A symbol has one foot in physicality and the other foot in the non-physical. So for instance, a hug is a symbol. You're using physical things like your arms and your body to express love or friendship for somebody else. So the physical part is your body and your arms, and the non-physical part is the love or the friendship you're kind of portraying. So a symbol has one foot in the physical and another foot in the non-physical. Sacrament is different. A sacrament is a special kind of symbol that actually causes to come about that which it signifies or that which it symbolizes, because it is created by the intentionality, the mindset, the faith, and the integrity of the person, receiving it. So the other two can lie. A sign can lie. I can go down to a signpost and turn it around, and somebody's looking to how to go to, Mountain View, and they're going the wrong direction. So I can make a sign lie. I can even make a symbol lie. Judas used the symbol of a kiss to betray Jesus. The symbol of love and friendship and devotion is used to say, this is the guy, go get him. So you can make a symbol lie, but you can't make a sacrament lie, because the sacrament is only created by the mindset, the faith, the integrity, and the intentionality of the recipient. So 2 people come up for communion, and this is back, it actually happened to me in St. Albert's Church about 15 years ago. 2 people come up for communion, I'm standing there distributing communion, and some people still want to receive in the tongue. And this 14-year-old kid comes up, he got his hands in his pockets, and he sticks out his tongue. And there's a wad of chewing gum at the other side. So I'm trying to insert Jesus between his teeth and the chewing gum. And the kid pushes it and goes back down to his seat. So what happened? He got a piece of bread, and that was it. Somebody else comes up, filled with devotion, really understands what this is about, and she puts out her tongue, and I put it in, and there's a real encounter happening between that woman and Jesus of Nazareth. Because it's her mindset, it's her faith system, it's her shift in consciousness that's actually creating it. So the sacrament is created, I believe, by the mindset and the faith of the person receiving it. So it's the observer effect, to kind of quote quantum mechanics. According to quantum mechanics, it is the observer that collapses the probability wave down to the specific outcome. And as a very famous cosmologist said one time, a guy called Brian Swim, he said very famously one time, a lecture I was listening to, and I stopped the podcast because it didn't make sense to me originally. He said, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. And I said, what? You tell me 1 billion years ago, the sky wasn't blue, and daffodils weren't yellow, and grass wasn't green? I put the podcast pad on, and he says, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. Because 1 billion years ago, the eye had not yet been invented. The eye was only invented 545 million years ago by a little creature called a trilobite. So 1 billion years ago, there were no eyes on planet Earth. So there was nothing to infer colour from the electromagnetic spectrum. And in the absence of an appropriate witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal aspects of itself. And the same thing is true of Eucharist, and the same thing is true of the Scriptures. In the absence of a particular kind of witnessing consciousness, the Scriptures are not free to reveal their real truth. So the real truth of the Scripture has to do with the mindset of the person doing the reading.
Well, there's two things. One is that I have a question, because if the Scriptures started being written at 80 AD, right?
Mark is 70 AD.
Yeah, 70 AD.
There are Gnostic scriptures which are earlier, but the canonical scriptures, that's the first one. Yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't he probably be about 90 or 100, and how did that get written, and the ones after? So
Okay.
even though you're saying it's... And the second part is just this little something. James, my husband, went to New York recently, and he brought me back a magnet. And it's the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus starts out and he says, I want you to really pay attention, because I don't want 4 versions of this.
Okay, great. So we deal with the two questions here. The first question is, chronology and age. And so allegedly, according to scholarship, the first canonical gospel was written about 70 AD. Now there are other earlier gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, may have been written about 50 AD. And certainly there were earlier, the writings of Paul go back to 51 AD. His letter to the Romans goes back to 51 AD. So there are people writing within 30 years of Jesus' death. But how about the age of the people who were writing these accounts? So if Mark is writing in 70 AD and Jesus died in 30 AD, and if Mark is a young boy, which allegedly he was, one story puts it that Mark is the character who in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, there's a kid sleeping just with his cloak around him, and they grab him and he leaves his cloak and he runs away naked. And some authorities claim that was actually Mark. So he would have been 16, 17. So by 70 AD, he's only in his 50s. So Mark and Matthew can kind of fit in easily enough. John is kind of problematic in the sense that if John's gospel is written about 100 AD, John would have been a centenarian, which is possible that he was. But the truth is that it's very probable that John did not write this gospel. That John had a disciple called John the Elder, who was the leader of the Ephesus church, and that it was a disciple of John the Elder, a third generation Christian, who was actually writing the Gospel of John. In actual fact, when you look at John's Gospel, there are 21 chapters in John's Gospel. Chapter 21 is stylistically very, very different from the rest of the Gospel. The Greek used in chapter 21, and chapter 21 have to do with a lot of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, like the time when he's on the shore, and the 7 of the disciples are fishing, and he points out to them where to fish, and they catch 153, and then he draws Peter aside, and he says to Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, I love you." "Peter, do you really love me?" "You know that I love you." "Peter, do you love me?" So he asked him 3 times. All that stuff is contained in chapter 21. And the end of chapter 1 ends with a very strange statement. It says, there are hundreds of other things that Jesus did, and I imagine that the world itself could not contain all the books that would need to be written if we recorded these. But we know that these are true because we know that the person who witnessed them had integrity. So obviously the person who's writing chapter 21 is very different from the person who's written chapters 1 through 20. And so it's possible that John was alive at the time of the promulgation of that gospel, but he very probably didn't write it. And your second one is about the versions then of the Beatitudes. So there are 2 versions of the Beatitudes, as I said, Luke's version and Matthew's version. And of course, everybody is free to interpret them whatever way they want. And so that's both the difficulty and the beauty of the teachings of Jesus. Anybody can make of them what they want, which is a difficulty and a benefit, because you can go back to the same story, the same parable of Jesus, 5 years down the road, and you can mine it for a much deeper message than you did when you were like 25 or 26 years old. At the same time, you can make it do anything you want. You can so parables are like statistics. You can make statistics tell you anything you want to tell. Yeah. Right. Maureen, can we get a microphone to you?
Luke has always interested me. Was he a medical doctor, and did he practice among his group?
Yeah. And so the belief system is that, yes, indeed, Luke was a medical doctor from Antioch in Syria, a very educated man, probably a disciple of Paul. So, as I said, Luke writes the Gospel of Jesus and then the Acts of the Apostles, both dedicated to the same character, Theophilus. But there's a very interesting thing in the Acts of the Apostles, I think it's around chapter 16, where Luke is talking about the young church. He's talking about Peter, but he's mainly dedicated to the voyages of Paul. And he's describing some of Paul's missionary journeys. But a very strange thing happens to the person in chapter 16, where Luke had been talking about Paul did X or they did Y. He now starts using we went to X or we went to Y. So there's a shift in the personal pronoun from third person singular to first person plural. So it's obviously at this stage Luke has joined Paul in these missionary journeys. So Luke obviously is an eyewitness to many of the events that were described in the second half of the Acts of the Apostles. So it's possible that he may have been a kind of a personal physician to Paul. So he accompanies Paul to for the rest of his journey and then reports not just Paul's earlier travels in the third person singular, but the first person plural. He's obviously there with Paul for the remainder of Paul's life.
You mentioned a contrast or conflict between Jesus and John the Baptist's teachings. Could you say a little about that? And I, in the past, had been led to believe that John the Baptist, well, they were cousins, right? That they were from the Essene tradition, and that Jesus was perhaps from the Essene tradition.
Okay. That's a great question, Dan. So again, it depends on which gospel you're reading. The relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist is a question of which part of which gospel you're actually reading. In Luke's gospel, they're cousins, that Mary and Elizabeth were cousins, and that John and Jesus actually met in utero. When Mary goes down to the hill country of Judea to meet her aunt Elizabeth, we're told that the babe in Elizabeth's womb leaped for joy. So it's like John in Elizabeth's womb was recognizing Jesus in Mary's womb. So according to Luke's gospel, they're cousins. In Matthew's gospel, they don't even know each other. So there's a story in Matthew's gospel where John has been jailed, and he's been hearing about this character called Jesus. And he sends out a message to Jesus to say, are you the one we've been waiting for? Or do we need to wait for somebody else? So you get the impression there that John has never met this guy, doesn't know who he is, and is checking out, is this the one I've been sent to kind of prepare the way for? So again, the Gospels have very, very, very different accounts of what the relationship between Jesus and John were. There is a tradition, as you mentioned rightly, Dan, that both John and Jesus were Essenes, living in the desert. The Essenes were a community living in Qumran who believed that Judaism had gone totally off the rails and that the priesthood was corrupt and the temple had been corrupted. And so they were trying to live a very, very kind of an ascetic life in the desert. So there's one story that they both came out of that community. And that, so again, in some of the Gospels, Jesus is a disciple of John the Baptist and is baptized by John. Mark's gospel starts off with that story. So Jesus starts off as a disciple of John the Baptist, and only when John dies does Jesus very reluctantly take over, charge of this young movement. But you find in the Acts of the Apostles that Paul will encounter communities in the diaspora who are still followers of John the Baptist. And when he begins preaching about Jesus, he said, no, you guys, you didn't get the whole story. John was the precursor to Jesus. And then he begins to explain to them about the relationship between John and Jesus' teaching, and then they're baptized. He says, John came preaching a baptism of water, but that's not Jesus. Jesus came preaching a baptism of the Holy Spirit. So you need to be rebaptized in the Holy Spirit, not just the water that John poured over you. So again, depending on which source you're looking at, there's a very different relationship between them. And in some stages, regarding John's followers are kind of, antiquated or out of date and need to be updated in some fashion.
So it makes perfect sense to me that it would be this way, that the Gospels are a reflection of both needs of community at the time and sociological circumstances they find themselves in. And so with Mark and the fall of the temple and the destruction, there is going to be that desperate last unanswered question of what's happened here. And perhaps 10 years later, the question rises, there is a reason to do this. We go back to the beginning. We find that he is the Moses, and he takes us along. And the movement gets big enough, and you have Luke, who says, we're not really a threat. We're, then the reach becomes wider. And maybe by the end, they finally, especially with someone having 2 generations of living with John the Beloved in Ephesus, you find someone kind of hearkening back to the mystical beginnings of this, but only after kind of the safety and the, sort of the MO of what is this about? We're a pilgrim people. All of those things need to be in place before you can expand it into something more esoteric.
Yeah, that's a brilliant observation, Karen. You're absolutely right. And so Mark's Gospel then is written about 70 AD. 70 AD was when the Second Temple fell. So there was a Jewish revolt against Roman occupation beginning in 66 AD that lasted for 4 years, and the Romans besieged Jerusalem, and it held out for 4 years. And then at the end, 70 AD, the temple is destroyed, flattened, the earth around the place is salted, so you can't grow anything there, and there's not a stone left upon a stone. The only part of the existing temple, of that temple, and then was kind of what's called the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, that's left there. And so, Christians living at that period of time are going to have a very, very different mindset. It feels like the end of the world has come. Now, they're all expecting the second coming of Jesus. And depending on which part of the scripture you're reading, Paul gives the impression in his first letter to the Thessalonians that Jesus is coming back imminently. And so he says to people, you shouldn't even change. If you're married, try to get a divorce. If you're not married, there's no point in getting married. If you're working, stay working, but if you're not working, don't get a job, because he's coming back immediately. So people took him at his word, and people just sat back and, okay, he's coming on Tuesday at 3:30. So Paul writes a second letter to the Thessalonians, and he says, I have a new rule for you. Those who don't work shouldn't eat. In other words, it's not happened yet. I don't know when it's going to happen. It will happen, but it's not imminent. And so, everybody needs to contribute. And so, in that sense, Jesus, the coming of Jesus is further out. You get to Luke's Gospel now. Luke is written in 90 AD. This is 20 years after the fall of Jerusalem. Luke is now trying to, as I say, to kind of ameliorate the situation and to hope that Theophilus would put in a good word with maybe the emperor for Christianity. And Luke is mixing up a whole bunch of stuff. When you read Luke's account of the eschaton, the last times, the end times, there's a whole bunch of stuff mixed in. Are you talking about the fall of Jerusalem? Are you talking about the death of Jesus Christ? Are you talking about your own death? Are you talking about the end of the world, the world itself is going to end? So when you read through the eschatology of the gospel accounts, these 4 strains are mixed in. And it's very hard to know, which one is primary. So did they really believe Jesus is coming back immediately, or that the end of the world was really upon us right now, or is that your own personal death, you need to be aligned before you die yourself, or that the fall of Jerusalem and the extraordinary carnage that happened there, that this represented, what's been talked about here. So you're absolutely right. The environmental circumstances, the audience to whom it's been addressed, and the agenda of the writer all influence the kind of material and the way it's proposed.
Seán, I completely agree with what you said about translation and about stories, but I have a number of friends who are very intelligent, and there are seminaries where the literal interpretation of the Gospels is taught and believed. And I can't reconcile the two, but these are intelligent people. How can they reconcile the two? Can you give me a little insight into that, please?
I can. It's called cognitive dissonance, Tom. I literally mean that. It's a term in psychology, cognitive dissonance. If you're trying to wrestle with 2 ideas which are, mutually exclusive of each other, you have to do some kind of accommodation to accept one and reject the other. So people who have a faith system which tells them what the reality is will have to kind of explain away any contradictory kind of evidence. And there's a lot of contradictory evidence there. So for instance, I talked about Luke's Gospel. Luke obviously has never been in the land of Israel. His knowledge of the geography of Israel is pathetic. He's constantly making mistakes, geographical mistakes. He obviously doesn't know a whole lot about Jewish customs, so he makes mistakes about, when he talks about the particular customs. So this is part of the Bible. How come? There's a statement between Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel where one occasion Jesus is walking through the cornfields on the Sabbath, and his disciples, or the wheat fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples are hungry. So they start breaking off heads of wheat and start grinding them in their hands and popping them into their mouth. Now technically that's harvesting. To pull off a head of wheat and grind it, take away the chaff and eat the corn, that's technically harvesting, which is forbidden on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees get really, really upset with Jesus and say, why are you allowing your disciples to do what's forbidden on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, didn't you read what David did? When he and his men were fleeing from King Saul, and he was hungry, and he broke into the temple, and he ate the bread of the shew, which is like Eucharist, like somebody broke into a church because they were a homeless person, broke in, raided the tabernacle, and ate all the hosts because they were hungry. And Jesus, didn't you hear that David did this? You know, and he's our father David. And Jesus says, when Abimelech was the high priest. Now that story is found in the first book of Samuel. And Abimelech was not the high priest. It was his father, Abiathar, who was high priest. So either Mark got it wrong, or Jesus got it wrong, or whoever wrote down the gospel, got it wrong. But they confused these two characters. So you got literally theological anachronisms, you got geographical anachronisms, but these people can explain away all this kinds of stuff because of the mindset. So it's like, don't confuse me with the facts, I'll explain away the facts because I have a pre-existing theory. So it goes back to translations. There are 3 ways of translating any text from one language group to another, including the Bible. And the first one is called literal translation, where you translate a noun with a noun, a verb with a verb, an adjective with an adjective. And you would think that that's kind of the best way to translate stuff. It's not, because you get what we call in my language, curry kainta. You get, I don't know what the English version of that, curry kainta, kind of phraseology, which when you translate it literally, it doesn't make any kind of sense whatsoever. There was an example, for instance, when they were trying to translate languages through artificial intelligence, and they took a proverb, out of sight, out of mind, and they ran it through a computer to kind of translate that and translate it back, and it came back as blind idiot. Out of sight, blind, out of mind, idiot. So it's like when you start running some phrases through a translation process, literally, it messes everything up. So biblical scholars do not use literal translation. The second one is called paraphrasing, where you start off with an idea of what you want the text to say, what message you want the text to deliver, and then you translate the original to say exactly that. And a lot of fundamentalist translations of Scripture do precisely that. They start off with a theology, they have a viewpoint, they've got a cosmology, and they're going to force their translations to align with that particular way. And the third way is called dynamic transference. And dynamic transference is where a real scholar who is, very au fait with the culture of the period, the history of the period, the coinage, the agriculture, the customs of it, and on the basis of that is trying to translate the material according to the mindset of the people of the time. But even then you can run into problems. So just at the moment I'm listening to a podcast, and this guy is a brilliant scripture scholar. I think his name is Michael Heiser. Brilliant, brilliant guy, and he's a very spiritual man, but he's pointing out that we have to try to translate the scriptures using the mindset of the people who actually wrote it at the time. We have to try to understand that. So modern fundamentalists are using 21st century mindsets to translate ancient stuff according to predetermined cosmologies of their own and taking it literally. But Michael Heiser, in my opinion, falls into the same kind of mistake. He's translating it, he's a very good scholar, according to the mindset of the people of the time, but he's translated it literally in their mindset and believing that that's actually what God said. So he believes actually in many of the things which, for me, are stories. They're kind of parabolic articulations of deep, ineffable truths. So he's a kind of a fundamentalist, but he's a great scholar. But his fundamentalism is based on the understanding of the people who actually wrote it or who heard it 4,000 years ago. Whereas our guys are writing on the basis of a fundamentalist understanding with a 21st century cultural overlay on stuff that was written 4,000 years ago. So it's very, very subtle. Literalism can come in very, very subtle guises. Yeah.
I have a question about the choice of reading. There are 4 who wrote not always the same thing. But who chose to read from Matthew or Mark according, a certain Sunday? Okay. Is it because that particular reading would fit in more of what you want to say, or what's the reason?
Right, that's a great question. And so in the Roman Catholic Church, there was a big book called the lectionary. And there's 2 kind of parts to the lectionary. There are the readings for the weekdays and readings for the Sundays. And the weekday readings are divided into a 2-year cycle. and the Sunday readings are divided into a 3-year cycle. So what they're trying to do is try to give you, in the Sunday readings, over the course of 3 years, a flavour for the kind of the scriptures, all of the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. And so typically, when this lectionary was being composed, there was a new version came out after Vatican II. So they're trying to organize the scriptures into readings that can be kind of pretty much read through on a 3-year cycle on Sundays or a 2-year cycle on weekdays. And they try to arrange them thematically. They take a theme. So they try to match an Old Testament reading thematically with a New Testament scripture. So they take a particular theme, like love of God or trust or whatever, and they try to match those up in the readings. Now, the Christian scriptures, the Roman Catholic Church has left out a whole bunch of other material called the Gnostic Gospels. And so about 10 or 11 years ago, a good friend of mine, who was a scripture scholar, did another version called the Uncommon Lectionary, and it's the little book that you see up here. This one here is called the Uncommon Lectionary. A guy called John Butcher, he was an Episcopalian priest and a good friend of mine, and he was part of the Jesus Seminar. It was a group of scholars who met on a regular basis to figure out what did Jesus really say and what was tacked on later. And John invited me at some stage. He said, you're a good preacher, but you're using only some of the material. Why don't you use the rest of the material? And so we decided as a community at that stage to start using this book, which contains readings from the canonical scriptures and from the Gnostic Gospels. So on a Sunday basis, the people who are assigned to the readings are free to choose any reading they want, as long as they give Joy a heads up beforehand, or me a heads up, so that I know that what the reading is going to be saying. For myself, I will sometimes change the assigned gospel reading because I want to speak to a particular topic, so I'll pick out a scripture reading of my own that kind of aligns more obviously with the theme of my homily. Yeah. Lawrence.
So just a couple of points. The Uncommon Lectionary is easily available on Amazon. People want to read it. It's good. Secondly, when we're doing readings from the main gospel, I don't know who built it, and I dare not look, but there's an interesting website called Bible Gateway, which has literally 20, 30 translations of every passage. Right. It has every translation of every passage. Right. So when we read something at Easter or Christmas, I tend to look at the different, since I do the lectures, the different translations, and I sometimes pick random alternative translations that look fun.
That's brilliant.
My question, to come on to the question, is why do you think these 4 Gospels were chosen to be the canonical Gospels? Was it... Now, you can have all sorts of conspiracy theories that things were being disappeared. On the other hand, these are the longest and the most detailed, and the ones that are, 3 of them are pretty consistent, and the other one's pretty sort of vibrant and powerful. And when you do that, you've got to get rid of a lot of stuff, and obviously there's a lot of Paul, a lot of John followers saying, well, we don't want all this Thomas stuff, and let's forget about James. So, but how do you interpret the selection that became the canonical?
I think it's a combination of some of the stuff you've mentioned, Lawrence. If you look at why are we a two-party state? Why are we a two-party, system of politics in this country? With Republicans and Democrats. We have a saying in Gaelic, "Rawa idir chawar daul," a choice between 2 blind goats. And very, very often, that's all the choices we have. So there are other places where it's a multi-party system, and that national elections are done, where you have a first preference, second preference, third preference, and there's a transfer of votes, like in Ireland. If there are like 9 candidates on the slate for a particular seat in Congress, you vote, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, third choice, and the winner has to read some kind of a quota. And if the winner doesn't reach the quota on the first ballot, then they excise the last person and they redistribute her votes among the other 8. And they keep doing that until one person reaches the quota. So you got a say in the election all the ways up the process. Now, something like that is happening, I think, with the decisions about what scriptures get included and what don't. The early churches, it's in the diaspora, in this dispersed Jewish world. So initially it starts off as a Jesus movement composed completely of Jews. All the leaders are Jewish. Every year, Jews from around the world would come back to the land of Israel for major feast days from the diaspora all over the world. In fact, the bulk of Jews lived outside the land of Israel at the time of Jesus, but they would come back to Jerusalem frequently for big accounts, and they'd want to know what's the latest happening, theologically or whatever. And so when Peter gave his first homily on Pentecost Sunday, his audience was a very, very mixed audience. It's listed in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 2. Who are the different groups who are actually listening to Peter? And they're all amazed. They're all hearing Peter speak in their own tongue. And then they carry that with them. And so very, very quickly, and particularly through the ministry of Paul, initially you have Gentiles attending Jewish synagogues because they're interested, in this guy. And then at some stage, the tail begins to wag the dog. And there are more Gentiles now than there are Jews, in this young movement. And eventually, the Jews get anathematized, and there's almost no Jews in the Jesus movement, and it's totally non-Jewish. So in that process as well, little communities all over the diaspora, led by different people. There's a Mary Magdalene church. There's a Johannine church in Ephesus. There's a Thomistic church in India. There's a Markan church. There's a Matthean church. There's a Lucan church. So there's churches who are kind of followers of these disciples. And each of these groups is producing writings, which they're sharing with each other. They're sending letters from one place to another, which are being read, on their Sunday gatherings. So this becomes the ultimate basis for the scriptures and for the New Testament. And so, many of these letters are being circulated, and there's somebody going to read these, and at some stage they then decide, which letters really represent our experience of the risen Christ in our Eucharistic encounters. And then at some stage there's need to kind of lick the group into shape, and particularly, beginning with, there are a few efforts, to kind of decide what gets in and what doesn't get in, and right up to the time of Luther. Luther threw out the Epistle of James out of the Bible. Didn't believe in it because James talked about sanctification through works. That James says very famously, if a poor person comes into the synagogue and you say, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you, but you don't feed him or you don't clothe him, what good is your faith to you? Whereas Paul is big on faith, James is big on works, and Luther is very much against works because at that stage the Roman Catholic Church is selling indulgences in order to get to heaven, and so Luther actually threw out the letter of James out of the Bible, and it was out for a period of time. And so there are books that got in and books that got out, books that got put in there by mistake. So for instance, in the Hebrew scriptures, when the Hebrews sat down to determine what was in their Bible, they had two criteria. The first one was to get into the Bible, it had to be written before 400 BC, and it had to be written in the Hebrew language. Now, on the basis of that, books got in that shouldn't have got in because they were written much later, but purporting to be written earlier, like the book of Daniel. Daniel was written allegedly during the Babylonian exile in 589 BC. Actually was written in the time of the Greek invasion of Israel, which is 187 BC. So Daniel got in, that shouldn't have got in. And there were books whose original Hebrew writings had been lost, and only Aramaic or Greek translations were left. And they got excluded because they weren't aware of the originals being written in Greek. So by applying these two criteria, books got in that shouldn't have, and books got kept out that might have. And the same thing that happens with the early Christian churches. It's a question of trying to, establish both orthodoxy and credibility. So if you live in a patriarchal world, around the time of Constantine, and you have churches led by women, you're not going to get very far. You're not going to be taken seriously if you have churches led by women. So very, very often, anything attributed to Mary or the women gets excluded. And even when they're mentioned in the other places, they're downgraded. Mary of Magdala is turned into a harlot. And so you have to exclude some of these. And then when Constantine had his vision in 313 AD, and he saw a sign in the sky on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, when he and another contender were wrestling to see who would be the undisputed emperor of Rome. And he saw this sign in the sky, which was a cross and a circle around it. And he interpreted it as a Christian symbol. Now, in actual fact, it's also the symbol of Mithraism, which is a much more ancient religion. But he interpreted it as a Christian symbol, and he decided he would, if he got the victory next day, he would allow Christianity to be a state religion. And he won the next day, and he made Christianity the state religion. And then he called the first council of the church, 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea. And he put the church fathers in session. He says, I want you guys to come out with a document that everybody can get behind. And in some sense, that included some kind of a canon of scripture that would all say, yes, this is the real deal. The other stuff, no, that's out. And he kept them in session. until I produced the Nicene Creed, the I believe in God the Father Almighty, the one that we learned as little kids. And then Constantine moved the seat of government to Istanbul, which he then renamed after himself. He called it Constantinople. And the seat of government was now in the hands of this Roman Catholic Church. And so it became very important, to kind of to march in unison, believe the same things, conduct the same kinds of liturgies, believe the same kinds of dogmas. And so there's a movement then to take any fringe activity or any activity that would kind of threaten the credibility of this new movement. So a lot of these factors are at work there. Guys, I realize that we got a picnic. It's 11 o'clock and we got a picnic, so thank you so much for your patience. Okay.